Welcome to Harbor's YouTube channel where we recap our Thursday night gatherings and share little bits of what we talked about and some of the discussion we had. So last night, Dawn continued in our series, the Book of Acts, where we have been studying the Book of Acts and using Willie James Jennings' commentary on the Book of Acts to understand it and kind of take a new take for many of us on this. And we've studied this book in the realm of this is a book of radical belonging, and there's so many complexities of it with empire and diaspora, but the heart of it is radical belonging. So, Dawn, can you share what did you talk about last night? How did it go? It was so lovely, but love to hear it.
Oh gosh, yeah. I ended when we all came back and I heard people's reactions. I was like, okay, maybe I should never talk about Paul again. And everyone was very affirming. I thought it would be interesting to start because we haven't looked at Paul yet. We've been looking at all kinds of other great stories about the community, but this was our first time looking at Paul and his beginnings. And he's such a controversial character. I'll be transparent and say I've got a bit of a soft spot for him, and also he's so problematic in so many ways in his writings and those who wrote after him. So I thought it might be good to just take a pause before jumping into that really exciting, conversion on the Damascus Road, and think about who he was before that conversion. And Willie James Jennings encourages us to do this. So we started with the first thing we learn about him, which is at an event, the stoning of Stephen, who's known as the first martyr. And after a rousing speech, that inflames everyone gathered in Jerusalem, the crowd just takes him out and stones him. And there's this little verse that says, they laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. And at the end of that account, and after we hear about the Stephen's community taking him away and burying him, is this line, and Saul approved of the killing. And then, I don't know if this is historically accurate, but the writer puts them at the same time that this is when the persecution of the church begins. And Saul is he is not deputized, he's not an agent of the temple or the government or anything, and he's just going around and taking in Christians for them to be tried, imprisoned, executed, whatever. So the three things that we talked about was, one, that he seems to be radicalized as a young man at the stoning of Stephen in Jerusalem. Second, he's from Tarsus, which is in Turkey. So he's traveled quite a way, and I'm really grateful to one person who pointed out some more of his biographical information in other letters, that he probably came to Jerusalem as a young man to learn and to sit at the feet of a teacher. So it's a diasporic community, but he's also got this because people in Tarsus, even though they were Jews, were granted Roman citizenship. So he has this kind of dual identity of being a Jew and also a citizen of the people who are oppressing him, which is kind of odd. And then finally, the fact that Willie James Jennings will not let us forget or walk away from is that he is a murderer. He is, and it's really important that we not glaze over that we sit with that this person who is, one of the founders of our faith, really. I mean, there's nothing in anybody's Christian thought that isn't influenced by Paul. But he took lives, in unjust and violent ways. But what comes out of that too is not only that we have to grapple with the fact that we follow a murderer as well as someone who was murdered, is that he is like many zealots. He is what Jennings calls a closed circle. So I think we call it like confirmation bias sometimes. Like we reinforce our own ideas by our actions, by our sources of information. And so we're just kind of always reinforcing the same ideas. And so we get further entrenched. And Jennings calls this a closed circle. And his conversion event on the Damascus Road, as he is on his way to go and arrest and imprison and execute more Christians, he is blinded by a light. He encounters Jesus, who identifies himself, asks Saul, "Why are you hurting me? Why are you persecuting me?" And in that moment, Saul is one, struck with blindness, and then he is taken in by another follower of Jesus named Ananias. And from that, he is converted and he becomes an apostle and a teacher of the Christian faith. And so Jennings suggests there's two things that we're able to break in and break that closed circle that we can kind of reflect on in our own lives. First is Jesus' vulnerability connecting with Saul's vulnerability. That, like, just that painful line of like, why are you hurting me? Not only in that voice of like women and children and victims, but also like the God that you worship. Why are you hurting me? And then just connecting with some place of Saul's invulnerability. And the second piece is just the wisdom of experience, right? And just those experiences that reason and logic, you just can't make an argument out of. You know, that great line from Jonathan Swift, you can't use reason to argue someone out of a position that they didn't use reason to get themselves into. It's that same thing. Like, and those experiences are important, and we don't need to try and reduce them down by logic. They will stand on their own. And those are the two ways he suggests that we break those closed circles, is when we share that vulnerability and those experiences that we have.
Dawn, that was amazing. I was amazed last night, and I'm amazed again at your recap. That was just, yeah, there's so much insight, and you really helped us journey with the severity of Saul, but also the beauty of Jesus's vulnerability and the transformation of Saul, Paul. And yeah, really striking. I wanted to follow up. So there's kind of the part one of the conversation is being, in a lot of ways, feels like being honest with his identity as a killer. Did your group talk about that at all?
Yeah. And one person we had a couple of people who've really studied the life of Paul. And I have to admit, like, as an Anglican preacher, we don't spend a lot of time in Paul's biography. We tend to spend it more in his writings, and we focus a lot on the Gospels. So really helpful for this information about, and these reminders of him saying, like, of all the sinners, I am the worst. I mean, he knows himself, who he is and what he's done. And then another, as most people know, I'm Canadian, and another Canadian in our group, we talked about how we're wrestling with the legacy of residential schools. And, there's this tension that every time government or civic groups that are particularly made up of white or settler people try to say, like, okay, enough, like, it's time to move on, Indigenous people are like, no, like, wait, you still have not grappled with the entire truth of what has happened to us. And so just that forcing us to stay. And in the words of probably one of our most famous senators who did so much of this truth and reconciliation work, Marie Sinclair, it took 7 generations to get us here. It's going to take 7 generations to get us out. And the first thing we have to do is grapple with that reality.
Yeah.
How about you?
Yeah, we use the word reckoning, right? Like there is reckoning. And I think there's a reckoning for us that find ourselves within the Christian tradition to reckon with Paul's identity. So we our breakout room leader asked us a question, and I said, I just have to say I'm so resistant in this conversation. So where you, Dawn, have a soft spot for Paul, I am at my most firm, high alert, tense place. So anytime we talk about Paul, I feel so much tension in my body, and I don't have a soft spot for him. I actually have so much resistance. So half of our group talked about we just are resisting seeing his humanity, right? And
Oh,
we
yeah.
are, and some people are like, I'm out. I am barely in this conversation. Other people were animated and excited to talk about Paul. So we were also just acknowledging our varying bodies in that moment and in that conversation. And one person shared in terms of Paul, that Paul was an extremist
Mhm.
as a killer and an extremist afterward. And that's how
Yeah.
she summarized him. She's like, I'm not a fan. He's always been an extremist and just shifted his energy. And
We
other
talked
people
about
are
that
like,
too.
oh, it's more redemptive than that. So we had a lot of conversation back and forth. But I do think using this very blunt language of Paul was murdering people and a killer, at least for me, gave me relief and like, great, we can have this
Mm.
conversation because we are reckoning with how atrocious his history was, and that all of a sudden he switches to then have spiritual authority. So,
Right?
uh, yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
we were really in the mix and back and forth, and it was very lively. Yeah, and we did also touch briefly. We tried to situate ourselves and ground ourselves to touch on this beautiful piece that you shared about Jesus is able to connect with Paul, not through winning an argument, not through this knowledge-based experience, but through being vulnerable and encountering him through this vulnerability that almost forces Paul into empathy and into change. So did you all talk about that piece or get to it? Yeah.
Yeah, we did. We talked about how, and someone else, we were talking about how change, although in this story it seems like it's instantaneous, right? And I shared, the story of and I publicly talked about this before, my dad's alcoholism and his involvement with AA. And he um he had a very dramatic start from another day. He had a very dramatic event that he was like, corks back in the bottle, never again. And he but it took him, I think he probably spent the next 45 years figuring out how to change. And I think he would say that too. He's gone now, but I think he would say that too. And just that change takes so much time. And Paul probably also took that time. And we see, like, if we really look at his letters, we look at them in the time, like in the order they were written or whatever, you can see he is changing over time. In one, he's talking about how love, nothing can separate us from the love of God. And in the next, he's like, here are all the things that can separate you from the love of God. So yeah, we did. We talked, and how we take those extreme. We are still the same people, even if our beliefs change. And so, learning how to be, how to transform, and transforming takes a lot longer
Mm.
than just converting.
Yeah, thank you, Dawn. That was a different flavor of our group, and it's helpful. I've shared with the Harbor community too. Both of my parents have been sober for 40 plus years, and they have, and my dad in many ways, not to the severity of Paul, but he has a textured life. And I would say, yeah, like, wow, how beautiful to see the redemption of change. And so I think there is this piece about Paul of that is hopeful of, yeah, no one can escape the love of God, right? That anyone um can, yeah, is not discounted, right? Regardless of the past. So that is the piece that is very redemptive about this story. And I think probably our discussion room, yes, we agree with that. And it's probably what happens after change that continues to make us grapple
Yes.
with Paul. So
Yeah.
I do think it's good to remind ourselves, wow, how beautiful that this story represents that we can have really horrific pasts
Yeah.
and still have a future and still contribute. And yeah, yeah. So there's a lot there. So
Yeah.
much to talk about. Thank you so much, Dawn.
Thank
You
you.
really took it on talking about Paul, and it was a gift. We are
Good.
so grateful. Next week is our last week in the series on the Book of Acts. And then in June, we're doing Pride Month at Harbor, which is always a treat. So thanks all
Yeah.
for tuning in.